Hello, this is Anthony from Oco Collaborative, Director of IT. For Makerspace night, tonight we're going to be discussing emulation. What is it, why people do it, and is it legal? First and foremost, you'll be seeing a lot of my avatar character for tonight's discussion, as I didn't really feel like recording a video of my mouth moving, as that's really all a webcam would offer us at this point. So I hope you enjoy the charismatic doodle that is my avatar here. And as another note, I am recording this from the Oak Hill recording lab in the Makerspace, just to make sure that we get that high quality audio. Now moving forward, what is emulation? Emulation is usually software built to imitate hardware, or hardware built to imitate other hardware. An example of hardware built to imitate hardware, for example, this one I found a little difficult to wrap my head around, is in the 1990 era Macintosh computers. They included DOS-compatible cards, little chips on the board, to enable them to run PC-exclusive programs, which is really cool, because you think about it, all of your Apple proprietary, Apple-only compatible software, wouldn't it be neat if you could run some of that on Windows or vice versa? We sort of already have something like that. With virtualization, you can use software called a hypervisor, which is something that's used to run what's called virtual machines, encapsulated environments where you can run various operating systems, Windows, Apple, Linux, you name it. In a way, these can be thought of as emulation devices all on their own, because it's using software to, on perhaps, let's say, for example, a Windows-based machine, to run the operating system exclusive to another machine entirely, which I think is really cool. Now, that's what emulation is. There's so many different flavors to it, but I'm going to be covering just a couple of examples here later in the discussion. Now, why do people use emulation? First and foremost, it's kind of a research tool. It's a form of simulation. Now, when you think about it, emulation, imitation, simulation, they all sound like three peas in a pod, don't they? It's because in the realm of computers, they usually are. The imitation of a machine executing binary code specific to another machine can be referred to as computer simulation. It can also be called emulation. A lot of big words that usually end up being, they're using emulation to simulate an abstract model that they can't get any other way. Another reason why people use emulation, to educate themselves. On a lower level, especially with like the older 90s game consoles, emulation can be fascinating to learn, as it aids in unraveling the mysteries of operations on a bit level. Really helps you understand the machine, so to speak. And I've seen a lot in my time at Youngstown State University. Computer science students will choose building an emulator as their final project, as their senior project. And this is because it demonstrates a deep understanding for that game system, or perhaps that computer's bus system, registers, flag system. When you're programming software to imitate hardware, you get very intimate with how the hardware was originally intended to operate, which can be highly beneficial, and it gives you knowledge that you can apply elsewhere in your field, if you're studying computer science, that is. Now, the reason why a lot of people use emulation, and some use emulation for this purpose and don't even know that they're emulating, is for fun. I've talked a little bit here and there about video games, and the most commonly seen form of emulation would have to be video game consoles, and this can be seen with the recent craze of mini consoles back in, I want to say, 2018, 2019, where people will purchase smaller, more compact NES NES like plug and play consoles, or I've seen even like PlayStation 1 ones floating around. And they come pre-packaged with games from your childhood, Crash Bandicoot and Super Mario Bros., all the classics. And they do this by building much smaller computer boards, by taking the original design of, let's say, the NES, and abstracting away a lot of the hardware to the emulator software, and breaking it down on a hardware level to the point where all they need is this little board that runs the NES emulator and also loads up those prepackaged games, which can be in the form of ROMs. Emulators don't have to come in the form of hardware either. These mini consoles are an example of hardware imitating other hardware, and you can actually just use stuff that you already own, like a computer or a smartphone, and install software emulators, software imitating hardware. And this has become quite popular lately, especially I've seen a lot of my friends installing a Game Boy Advance emulator onto their phones so that they can play GBA games on the go. I'm not a fan of it. I'm a tactile input kind of guy. I like to feel the buttons I'm pressing. On-screen controls just don't do it for me. But aside from that, some even go as far as, building their own handheld emulation device, kind of looping back into hardware that emulates hardware. So there's Adafruit projects that you can do with your Raspberry Pi, where you 3D print the case, wire the components together, install an operating system, Linux-based operating system called RetroArch to the Raspberry Pi that comes pre-built with all these cores that represent different emulators for different gaming machines. Another route that I've seen a lot of people go, this is more on the hobbyist side for sure, because it requires a lot of woodworking, but I've seen people build homemade arcade cabinets. These are common first-time projects for anyone experimenting with a Raspberry Pi system-on-a-chip computer, or maybe just those who want an authentic Pac-Man arcade cabinet in their man cave or garage, but don't want to really shell out all the dough for an authentic one. And finally, to kind of wrap up this discussion on why people use emulation, kind of following in tune with the video game emulation, a lot of people emulate to preserve video game history, because while companies will subscribe to the philosophy of locking it in the vault, kind of like how Disney does, where they'll take movies that haven't been on sale in years and remaster them or re-release them when there's more demand. Video game companies do a similar thing, or sometimes they don't. They just release the game for a specific console, and then it never sees the light of the market again after its lifespan. So by preserving video game history in the form of ROMs, we can pull video game data from their own disks and cartridges and preserve them in the form of software on computers long before the hardware it originally came from starts deteriorating. Like some of the old Atari cartridges maybe weren't stored correctly, and they start growing rust or on the circuits. Now, this kind of segues into our next question here, and it's whether or not emulation is legal. As you can see, for research and educational purposes, no one's going to bang down your door because you're in your room building an emulator for your senior project. So this kind of already establishes the fact that the act of emulation itself, at least in the United States, is not illegal. As a matter of fact, you can even distribute your emulation software as free open source software and have other people help you design and develop it, which is really cool. And then on the video game side of things, for storing them as ROMs by pulling them from the cartridge and putting them in the form of a ROM or an ISO file, there comes the risk well, I guess, temptation of distribution of this video game data in the form of a ROM or ISO or what have you on the internet. And for some video games, this is actually legal. This is usually software that the copyright has expired on, and the company is long gone. Like, they're never going to return to this to even renew the copyright. So in cases like this, software falls under the category of something called abandonware, in which it is legally free to distribute. The challenge of abandonware is usually it's for old DOS computers or not very well-known gaming consoles. So the challenge comes with setting up the appropriate emulator or environment where this game data can be run. Now, for a lot of video game data that's being archived and backed up, it's actively discouraged by game companies, as it is indeed a form of piracy, taking copyrighted code and distributing it as though it were your own. And there are very, very few cases where ROMs are being sold, but even when ROMs are distributed for free, that's money that Nintendo or Sony or Xbox can be missing out on if they were deciding to re-release those games in the form of another mini console or on their respective marketplace. Now, then there's a layer that goes even deeper than the hardware and the software, the video game data. There's kind of a firmware software in between where in order to get the emulator that you built to run these games, you need to obtain the dumped, which is where it's what it sounds like. You take the console and you turn it up on its head, and whatever falls out, that's the BIOS code. By obtaining the dumped BIOS code of these game machines, it enables it to operate as, a regular game console. And this is legal. This is legal as long as the BIOS code is obtained from hardware that you have bought and own, which means that it's actively discouraged to also distribute BIOSes online, which is firmware unique to your console, and giving it to someone else so they can run ROMs on their emulator for a console that they don't own. Now, this segues into an even more interesting subject, one that's being actively debated legally. So it's a bit more of a gray area, and the reason why it's a gray area is because not distributing, but using ROMs of games that you already own. Like, say you have a cartridge that you backed up the ROM of, and that ROM's on your computer and the cartridge goes bad. Wouldn't it be, for example, fair use to be able to take that ROM and play that game as you did the physical cartridge that you owned? Well, this is shaky territory, as fair use is a gray area to begin with. Simply because you own the cartridge may not always guarantee that you are legally allowed to, download ROMs from other distributors. Now, you can argue that you backed up your own ROMs and that you didn't download them, but it's difficult to be able to tell the difference, and no matter which way you go about it, the company is still losing out on profits that they could have obtained from redistributing those games and reintroducing them to the market. So, at the end of the day, whether or not ROMs are legal, it's a gray area. It's a lot of it's hypothetical, and to which I say there is no clear-cut answer. It really depends on, well, for one, the emulator will always be legal, so you don't have any issues with there. But two areas that you want to focus on is how did you obtain the ROM, and is it some kind of abandonware? Is it non-copyrighted code that you perhaps your friend made a Game Boy game on their computer, and before they put it on a cartridge, they want you to test it? That is an example of a legal ROM. And the BIOS that you need to run the emulator and the ROM, how did you obtain that? Did you dump it from a console that you currently own when you backed it up, or did your buddy hand it to you on a flash drive? It kind of falls in line with, if it feels like it's illegal, it might be, and it probably is. So that's my answer to whether or not emulation is legal. That's today's Makerspace discussion topic, brought to you by the Makerspace Podcast Lab. I hope you all enjoyed listening to me ramble. Be sure to leave comments below on whether or not you think emulation should be legal, illegal, and on what grounds. So until next time, this has been Makerspace Night Online.